I was raised believing that God was a book of rules, and that love was a reward for obedience. In Vitoria, I learned very early how to be an example, a trained smile, rehearsed answers, guilt hidden in my pocket like spare change. I didn't become one of Jehovah's Witnesses because of a revelation. I joined because of people, because of friendship, because of a group that felt like family, and when I realized it, I was already trapped inside a system where even the way you breathe comes with a manual. What no one saw was the cost. I became a ministerial servant, a pioneer, a construction volunteer, and eventually an elder, while inside, I was slowly disappearing. I watched control disguise itself as loving care. I saw abuse treated as sin, not as crime. I saw fear turn into doctrine and reputation turn into a cage. And when I finally said enough, I learned that leaving isn't a door, it's a fire. Phone calls, messages, accusations, silence, abandonment. Today, I'm going to tell everything. From the beginning to the very end. No romanticizing, no performance, just the truth of a man who believed he was serving God, until he realized he was serving a machine. And I need you to stay with me, because the details change everything.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm a former Jehovah's Witness, and this channel is a space to share real stories from people who lived inside controlling religions and carried feelings they were almost never allowed to express. Religions can also cause deep trauma in people's lives. Today, I'm going to tell the story of Lucas, a former elder who gave everything to his faith, served faithfully for years, and carried doubts and pain he was never allowed to express. So you don't miss any of our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. And if you'd like to share your own story, my email is in the description. I can create a sensitive narration and share it here, so more people can understand how you felt, and know that you're not alone.
I was born and raised in Vitoria, in an environment where religion wasn't a choice, it was the air you breathed. My mother was already an Adventist when I was born, and inside my home I learned early that faith meant discipline. Sabbath observance, rules, behavior, appearance. I come from a very large family, with 12 siblings, and that taught me to be the child who doesn't cause trouble. For about 12 or 13 years, I truly lived Adventism. I attended, I believed, I studied in an Adventist school, and I was deeply committed. I wasn't someone just passing through, I was part of the system. I learned to associate God with routine and approval. I learned to measure my value by performance. I learned that questioning was a sign of spiritual weakness. And that made me vulnerable, because when a religious structure offers absolute certainty, it speaks directly to our deepest fear, the fear of being wrong. I grew up trying to get everything right. I grew up trying to be good. I grew up trying to deserve love. I remember this vividly. I spent my entire life in the same congregation. I didn't move between congregations, didn't change halls, didn't disappear and reappear somewhere else. Everyone knew me. I grew up there. I was formed there. My entire spiritual identity was built in one single place, surrounded by the same people watching me grow, judging my progress, and measuring my worth over time. The door into Jehovah's Witnesses wasn't my family. I did have relatives who were witnesses on my father's side, including my great-grandmother, but they weren't the reason. What pulled me in was friendship. I had a childhood friend, we'd known each other since we were 5, and I watched his family move in and out of religion. His mother was a witness. Then she left, and one day she was reinstated and returned with full force. When she came back, my friend came back too, and he brought me along. I was studying at a full-time school, so at the end of the day, instead of going home, I went with him to the meetings. At first, I didn't call it faith. I called it routine and atmosphere. I saw a lot of young people. I saw people who paid attention to me. I saw a social club with clear rules. And there was another thing, soccer. The group's social life gave me a sense of belonging. I didn't join saying, I found the truth. I joined saying, I feel at home. And when someone feels at home, they lower their guard. I remember this vividly. In the beginning, I didn't have the discernment to separate truth from falsehood. I was absorbed by osmosis. I listened, I repeated, I adapted. And one detail really hooked me: the sense of organization. Everything seemed planned, clean, aligned, procedural. And for a teenager, that feels safe. I was also fascinated by the big events, conventions, and assemblies. They felt like a social paradise, a place where everyone smiled the same way and spoke the same language. I felt important just by being there. And I started receiving support as if I had been spiritually adopted by a family inside the congregation. That creates a powerful bond. When you feel welcomed, you start to owe loyalty. I saw myself surrounded by people who claimed to love God and love one another, and I began to confuse that with unconditional love. But there was a condition: obey, fit in, follow the script. At that stage, I didn't recognize the condition, I only felt the comfort. I began to believe that this world was safer than the real one, and that was the beginning of my surrender. I remember this vividly. I remember this vividly. I remember this vividly. When baptism came up, I wanted to rush it. I asked to be baptized at 16 and was rejected twice. That shook me because I interpreted rejection as spiritual worthlessness. On the third attempt, I was approved and baptized at 17 at a special one-day assembly and old arrangement. I remember the feeling of being stamped. Now I was official. I wanted to belong without doubt, without margins. I didn't want to be seen as someone who was just tagging along. I wanted respect. And from that point on, I became the young man who tried to do everything right. I became the young man who wanted to please. I became the young man who spoke the group's language. I started using the terminology, the expressions, and measuring my life by theocratic goals. I didn't see this as pressure. I saw it as honor. I thought it was beautiful to be corrected, because I interpreted correction as care. I wanted the elders to like me. I wanted them to trust me. I wanted them to see me as an example. Baptism wasn't just an act for me. It was a psychological contract. I signed my identity away. And when you sign away your identity, you defend it with your life. I remember this vividly. I remember this vividly. 1 year after my baptism, I became a ministerial servant. I was young, and that filled me with pride and fear at the same time. I served as a ministerial servant for nearly 10 years. I was especially involved in the service department, territory, preaching organization, encouragement, arrangements with young people. I liked feeling useful, like I was making the work move forward. And the more I did, the more visible I became. In that world, being visible is dangerous, but also addictive. I started living to meet expectations. I wanted to be the guy who always said yes. The guy who was available. The guy who was reliable. The guy who carried the load when there weren't enough people. And it became a habit. If they asked, I accepted. If they demanded, I delivered. I said it was for Jehovah, but deep down I also wanted human approval. I wanted to look at myself and say, I matter. The organization offers a clear ladder: baptism, servant, pioneer, privileges. And I climbed that ladder fast. But a ladder is also a funnel. The higher you go, the less space you have to be yourself. My personal life, my desires, my needs had to shrink to fit the role. I didn't call that a prison. I called it dedication. I remember this vividly. I remember this vividly. When I turned 18, I entered what felt like a heroic phase: Kingdom Hall construction and renovations. I worked in the capital, in the countryside, participated in many projects. I always said, more than 15, and if I count renovations, it's far more than that. I became what they called a traveler, moving wherever there was work. I carried tools, I carried weight, I carried responsibility. And even so, I was criticized. Elders would reprimand me for missing meetings. That hurt, because I wasn't missing them for leisure. I was working for Jehovah. I felt misunderstood, like my best was never enough. I believed that if I was involved in kingdom work, I should be praised, not corrected. But the system measures attendance, not intention. It measures conformity, not sacrifice. I began to see the paradox. On one hand, they say the work is the priority. On the other, if you're not sitting in a chair at the meeting, you're suspicious. I swallowed that, thinking silence was humility. I kept quiet, believing silence was spirituality. And I kept going, because I didn't want to disappoint. Later, construction arrangements changed invitations, builders, forms, and sometimes I wasn't called anymore. But at that time, all I saw was mission. I remember this vividly. When the construction arrangement changed, I even filled out the official application to continue serving as a builder. I signed it, I submitted it, and I was never called. That silence hurt more than rejection. It was another quiet lesson that effort does not guarantee belonging. I also became a regular pioneer. In that culture, pioneering is a seal people measure your spirituality by hours and presence. I attended pioneer school. I remember 2014 as a time of new material, treated as a major spiritual milestone, as if a new book meant divine light. I absorbed the vocabulary. I repeated the phrases. I shaped my schedule to fit the theocratic. I believed I was building a future in the new world. At the same time, I began noticing subtle pressures. If you don't show up, someone comments. If you don't produce, someone measures. If you don't fit, someone interprets. I became sensitive to other people's eyes. I learned to live afraid of looking weak. I learned to anticipate criticism. I learned to manage my image. That kind of exhaustion is never called exhaustion, it's called zeal. I also saw how young people were captured by privileges. The earlier you receive responsibilities, the earlier you feel important, and the harder it becomes to leave. I was inside that machine. I saw how titles become identity, and when identity becomes title, you start losing yourself. Still, I called it joy. I called it refreshment. I called it blessing. I remember this vividly. One defining moment was when I went to an isolated territory in Sierra, in the region of Meruoka. I was invited by a highly respected brother, a special pioneer who later became a circuit overseer. I traveled alone by plane for the first time and stayed for 2.5, almost 3 months. I lived inside the Kingdom Hall. It felt like a spiritual trial by fire. Even though I wasn't an elder yet, I ended up handling responsibilities usually assigned to elders, conducting the school, conducting the watchtower, giving public talks. I felt needed. I felt important. I felt like God was using me. My routine was total service. Preaching, arrangements, responsibility, with little personal life. And to me, that was a medal. I returned telling the story like an achievement. I saw that experience as confirmation that I was on the right path. When I returned years later, around 2022 or 2023, just to visit, I realized how memory weighs on you. I reconnected with people, relived the sense of mission, and understood that part of my self-worth had been built on extreme service. I didn't learn to have value for being Lucas. I learned to have value for serving. That lesson looks noble, but it hides a trap. If one day you stop serving, you feel like you stop existing. Back then, I didn't see the trap. I only saw the glow. I remember this vividly. In 2018, I visited Bethel. I went with my mother and that same childhood friend. For me, Bethel was a dream, God's house, the center, the perfect place. I was impressed by the beauty, the organization, the feeling that everything worked there. I left with more admiration, more desire to serve, more certainty that I was in the right place. Later, I would hear the other side from people who served there and described heavy routines and pressure, but at that moment, I only saw the shine. I also participated in parts at conventions and assemblies. There was a time when dramas still existed, and I took part in demonstrations and live presentations. I remember 2014 as one of the last years before the big shift to video-heavy formats. That fed my sense of role, belonging, and importance. Even small details became symbols like the beard. I had skin problems, painful bumps, and I forced myself to shave every 2 days to look acceptable. When beards were allowed, I felt relief and even thought I looked better. But that reveals the control. Even my face, my skin, my body had rules. I called it spirituality. Today, I call it normalization of the body. I remember this vividly. If I had to summarize this first phase, I would say this. I was shaped by belonging, discipline, and status. I entered through people, stayed because of structure, and went deeper because of purpose. I became a servant early, a pioneer, a construction worker, a traveler, collecting credentials that felt like love. I learned to translate exhaustion into virtue and silence into humility. I learned that baptism rejection means try harder, and praise means do more. I learned to live for approval, and the more approval I received, the more trapped I became by the role. I also learned to speak their language. Privilege, assignment, arrangement, refreshment, zeal. I learned to measure faith by schedule and performance. I learned to negotiate my needs so I wouldn't disrupt the theocratic. I built my self-esteem on function. I built my identity on usefulness. And that is crucial to understand what comes next, because when you are trained for years to swallow things, you endure what you should refuse. But conscience doesn't die, it accumulates. And it charges interest. When I was appointed as an elder, it happened during the pandemic. It wasn't a ceremony in a kingdom hall, with handshakes and smiles. It happened through a screen, through Zoom, in a strange, muted world where everything already felt unreal. Still, that day was one of the happiest of my life. I was young, around 26 or 27, and I honestly didn't expect it. Inside the organization, becoming an elder means you've reached a level of trust and status that few achieve so early. I felt chosen. I felt validated. I felt like all the years of sacrifice had finally paid off. I told myself, now I can really help people. I believed I was stepping into a role of care, wisdom, and spiritual shepherding. What I didn't understand yet was that I was also stepping into a machine that runs on pressure, silence, and emotional suppression. The pandemic accelerated everything. There was no gradual transition. One day, I was a hard-working servant. The next, I was responsible for people's lives, reputations, and spiritual standing, and I wasn't prepared for that weight. No psychological training, no emotional tools, just manuals, procedures, and the expectation of obedience. I confused fear with responsibility. I confused anxiety with zeal. I told myself that if I felt overwhelmed, it meant I needed to pray more, do more, sacrifice more. That belief would slowly destroy me. As an elder, my workload exploded. I was assigned to the service department, and that role alone can consume a person. I was responsible for more than 30 regular pioneers. That meant constant messages, constant problems, constant emotional crises, people fighting, people gossiping, people accusing each other, people crying, people threatening to give up, people demanding attention, and everything came to me. I was expected to mediate, correct, encourage, discipline, and somehow still appear calm and spiritual. There was no space to be human. I couldn't say I was tired. I couldn't say I was confused. I couldn't say I was angry. Elders are not allowed to break. Behind the scenes, the congregation wasn't the loving paradise it appeared to be. It was full of jealousy, competition, and silent power struggles. Reputation mattered more than truth. Image mattered more than healing. I started realizing that many problems weren't spiritual at all. They were emotional, psychological, relational, but the only tools we were allowed to use were Bible verses and organizational instructions. And when those didn't work, the blame always fell on the individual. Not enough prayer, not enough faith, not enough effort. Carrying that every day began to drain me. I started going home exhausted, numb, empty. But I told myself this was the best life ever. The meetings began to change for me. Or maybe I changed, I still don't know. During the pandemic, everything moved to Zoom. And at first it felt convenient. But very quickly, it became suffocating. My job outside the organization is mentally exhausting. I spend my days solving problems, thinking, deciding, and then, at night, I was expected to log into meetings that felt mechanical, repetitive, lifeless. I would turn on the meeting, turn off my camera, and fall asleep. Not once, many times. And the worst part wasn't the sleep, it was the guilt. I wasn't being refreshed. I wasn't being fed. I was forcing myself to attend something that drained me even more. And yet, attendance was non-negotiable. Even when the organization reduced reporting requirements, the control didn't disappear. It changed form. Now it was photos. Group chats filled with smiling faces, preaching selfies, proof of presence. If you weren't in the photo, you were weak. And if you were weak, someone would call you. I suggested separating announcement groups from photo groups just to reduce pressure. I eventually stopped participating in the photo groups altogether. It felt invasive, performative, artificial. Spirituality had turned into content production, and as an elder, I was expected to enforce this culture, even though it was slowly suffocating me. After the pandemic, something shifted permanently. The organization wasn't the same, and neither was I. Meetings became emptier. Attendance dropped. Discourses became more aggressive, more insistent. There was constant emphasis on obedience, loyalty, and presence. It no longer felt like encouragement. It felt like coercion. The message was clear. If you're not here, something is wrong with you. Zoom became stigmatized. If you attended via Zoom, you were labeled weak, spiritually sick, or problematic. Ironically, Zoom also allowed people to attend without actually attending, cameras off, minds elsewhere. I saw the hypocrisy clearly. I was part of enforcing standards I no longer believed in. And internally, I began to crack. I started asking questions I had avoided for years. Why does everything feel so controlled? Why is rest treated like laziness? Why does love feel conditional? Why does this happy people environment make me anxious and miserable? I noticed that even my body reacted. Wednesdays became unbearable. By Wednesday afternoon, I already felt sick, tight chest, racing thoughts, a sense of dread. I wasn't rebelling, I was collapsing. And instead of asking, what is wrong with this system, I kept asking, what is wrong with me? At one point, I seriously considered changing congregations. I thought maybe the problem was the environment, not the system. I told myself that a fresh start in another hall might fix the exhaustion, the anxiety, the constant pressure. But deep down, I knew I would be carrying the same weight with me. The structure would be the same, the rules would be the same, the control would be the same. Changing congregations would only change the scenery, not the reality. Long before the pandemic, I had already touched forbidden ground. More than 10 years earlier, I had stumbled upon a website run by former Jehovah's Witnesses. At first, it was curiosity. I wanted to defend the organization. I wanted to prove them wrong, but curiosity turned into compulsion. I read secretly. I felt guilty. I prayed for forgiveness. I compared it, later, to addiction, not because the content was evil, but because of the cycle: curiosity, fear, guilt, relief, repeat. When I became an elder, I managed to stop for a while. I told myself I was strong, but the questions never disappeared. They only went underground. During the pandemic, they resurfaced with force. I could no longer ignore the contradictions. The more responsibility I carried, the more clearly I saw the cracks. I saw how decisions were made. I saw how power operated. I saw how obedience mattered more than conscience. And I started to feel something dangerous inside me: moral dissonance. My values and my role no longer aligned. I was teaching things I didn't fully believe. I was enforcing rules that hurt people. I was defending procedures that felt wrong. That kind of inner conflict doesn't scream at first. It whispers. And those whispers began to keep me awake at night. One moment that deeply disturbed me involved disaster relief and donations. During a major natural disaster, there was a clear instruction: do not participate in independent fundraising efforts. Do not donate through external channels. Only donate through the organization's official system. That bothered me profoundly. People wanted to help. People wanted to act immediately. But control came first. Structure came first. Image came first. I started noticing how often compassion was filtered through bureaucracy. Everything had to be centralized. Everything had to be authorized. Even kindness needed permission. That was when the phrase, loving arrangement, began to sound hollow to me. I also noticed how elders themselves were breaking. Many were emotionally unprepared, intellectually untrained, psychologically overwhelmed. Yet, they were expected to handle trauma, depression, abuse, and family crises with nothing but outlines and letters. I had become an elder young, and even I could see how absurd it was. We were adultifying young men, giving them authority without maturity, responsibility without support, and I began to see another truth. privileges were being used as bait. Status was the currency used to keep men inside. Without privileges, a man had no voice, no respect, no visibility, and often no prospects for marriage. That realization made me sick. I was inside a system that manufactured dependence and called it spirituality. My personal life suffered deeply during this period. Relationships became a source of fear instead of joy. I had already experienced failed relationships, and each one added another layer of judgment. He can't make a relationship work. Something is wrong with him. Inside the organization, your romantic life becomes public property. And as an elder, the pressure was unbearable. I felt like I had only one chance to get it right. One mistake, and my reputation would be permanently damaged. I lived with constant anxiety, trying to be perfect, trying to meet expectations, trying not to fail. Even when relationships ended for normal human reasons, incompatibility, emotional struggles, personal growth, they were interpreted spiritually. Everything is spiritualized. Everything is moralized. I started associating love with risk, intimacy with exposure. At the same time, I carried deep regret about education. I had the opportunity to study engineering. My father was willing to pay. But I refused, afraid it would interfere with meetings. I chose a technical path instead. Later, I managed to build a career and earn degrees, but the regret remained. That was another crack. I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by fear of displeasing an organization, not God, an organization. That distinction became impossible to ignore. My father was willing to pay for me to study engineering. The opportunity was real, it was concrete. And I turned it down, not because I lacked ability, but because I feared missing meetings and being seen as less spiritual. That decision still echoes inside me. As an elder, I was also confronted with the darkest side of the system: cases of abuse. I handled 2 cases involving minors. What I saw horrified me. Abuse was treated primarily as sin, not as crime. Procedures focused on internal reporting, not external protection. I followed instructions. I made phone calls. I read letters. And I felt sick. In one case, the abuser had harmed multiple children, and nothing happened. No police involvement, no real accountability. The emphasis was always on the organization's reputation, on avoiding bringing reproach. I watched mothers suffer. I watched children remain silent. And I was expected to participate in a system that normalized that silence. I questioned why certain sins were announced publicly, while abusers remained unnamed. The logic collapsed in front of me. I couldn't reconcile what I was doing with what I believed was right. That was the point where something broke inside me permanently. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer justify. I could no longer say, Jehovah will fix it. I realized that waiting for God to fix institutional harm was a convenient way to avoid responsibility. That realization marked the beginning of the end. By then, my body was screaming what my mouth couldn't say. Anxiety attacks became frequent. I felt physically ill before meetings. I dreaded Wednesdays. I dreaded Sundays. I dreaded the sound of organizational voices. I was offered an alternative: stay inactive for years, fade quietly, just attend occasionally. But I couldn't. I was too disgusted. I couldn't sit in a kingdom hall pretending anymore. I couldn't listen to talks without feeling angry. I couldn't hear the governing body without feeling manipulated. I realized something crucial. My friendships were conditional. My love was conditional. My belonging was conditional. And I asked myself a simple question: would I keep living like this just to avoid losing people who only loved me if I obeyed? The answer was no. That decision didn't bring relief immediately. It brought fear, terror, actually. But it was also the first honest decision I had made in years. I decided I would leave with clarity, not confusion. I would speak, not disappear. And that decision set everything in motion. The last meeting I ever attended was the annual meeting on October 4th. After that day, I never returned to a regular meeting again. That date became a quiet marker for me. I didn't announce it. I didn't make it dramatic, but internally, something had already ended. I was an elder in name and a dissenter in conscience. I had seen too much, carried too much, and sacrificed too much to continue lying to myself. The machine that once gave me identity now filled me with nausea. The structure that once felt safe now felt predatory. And for the first time, I stopped asking, "How do I fix myself?" and started asking, "Why am I trying to survive something that is killing me?" The answer terrified me because it meant leaving everything I had ever known, my status, my future, my relationship, my community, my identity. But it also meant something else, the possibility of being free. The moment everything truly shattered was when I dealt directly with cases of abuse involving minors. As an elder, I handled 2 of them. I had heard rumors before, like everyone does, but being inside the process is something else entirely. It strips away any illusion you still have. I saw how the system reacts when faced with something that should trigger immediate protection, urgency, and justice. Instead, what I saw was slowness, procedural language, and fear, not fear of harm continuing, but fear of bringing reproach. Abuse was framed primarily as a sin, not a crime. The priority was internal handling, not external accountability. I remember sitting with information that made my stomach turn and being told exactly what steps to follow, without room for questioning. Phone calls were made, notes were taken, letters were written, always letters, and over everything hovered an unspoken rule that no one needed to state aloud. Authorities were not the priority. I followed the process because that was what obedience looked like. And with every step, I felt something inside me eroding. I felt complicit. I felt contaminated. I felt like I was betraying something fundamentally human inside myself. I had joined believing the organization protected the vulnerable. In that moment, I realized protection was conditional, selective, and often secondary to reputation. That realization didn't explode. It poisoned me slowly, silently, and permanently. One of those cases involved an abuser who had harmed multiple children, more than 4. That detail alone should have changed everything. It should have triggered alarms, urgency, immediate outside intervention. Instead, nothing happened in any meaningful sense. No police involvement, no transparent action, no warning to protect others. I was told that records existed, that Bethel was aware, that the matter was being handled, but I learned quickly that handled did not mean stopped, exposed, or prevented. It meant contained. I watched mothers struggle with confusion and grief, torn between protecting their children and trusting a system they had been taught never to question. I watched silence imposed as if it were a spiritual virtue. Meanwhile, the congregation continued normally. Smiles, songs, talks about safety, love, and unity. The contrast was unbearable. I kept asking myself why certain sins are announced publicly while others are buried. Why a smoker is named, but an abuser is hidden. Why image mattered more than children. The explanations collapsed under their own weight, and the most disturbing realization came quietly. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system working exactly as designed. What I was witnessing was policy, not accident. That understanding broke something in me beyond repair. Waiting on God stopped feeling faithful. It started feeling like an excuse to avoid responsibility. And I understood, with painful clarity, that silence itself can be a form of violence. After those cases, my internal conflict became unbearable. I could no longer speak with integrity. I stood on platforms telling people to trust the organization while knowing exactly what that trust concealed. I listened to myself, give counsel, and felt like an actor reciting lines in a play I despised. My anxiety intensified. Physical symptoms appeared more frequently and more aggressively. Tightness in my chest. Trembling hands. Racing thoughts that wouldn't slow down. Meetings became unbearable, not because of laziness or lack of faith, but because I felt morally contaminated. Every organizational video felt manipulative. Every governing body update felt hollow. Every call for obedience triggered nausea. I realized I was no longer dealing with doubt. Doubt still hopes. What I felt was disgust. And disgust does not fade with time. It demands distance. Elders offered me a solution that preserved appearances. Fade quietly. Stay inactive. Attend occasionally. Say nothing. Protect the image. But I couldn't accept that. I had seen too much. Silence would make me complicit. Staying would mean betraying myself completely. I reached a moment of brutal clarity. If I stayed, I would destroy myself psychologically. The cost of leaving terrified me, but the cost of staying was greater. That realization did not bring peace. It brought urgency, and urgency forced me to act before fear could paralyze me again. I chose to leave deliberately, not impulsively. I didn't want chaos. I wanted truth, clarity, and finality. I sat down alone and wrote a short, direct letter. No accusations. No dramatic language, no attacks, just a clear statement of conscience. I sent it to one elder and asked him to forward it to the rest of the body. Then I did something that felt both symbolic and terrifying. I left every group chat immediately. Service groups, elder groups, announcement groups, everything. The silence that followed was deafening. That same day, I recorded 3 videos. Not to start a movement, not to recruit followers, not to attack anyone. I explained calmly that I wasn't forming a new religion, wasn't trying to convince anyone, wasn't asking people to leave. I didn't send the videos to anyone in the congregation. I believed that those who truly wanted to understand would find them on their own. That belief was naive. The videos spread quickly. Suddenly, my private decision became public spectacle. My phone exploded with calls and messages. People from my neighborhood, from my past, from congregations I had served. Friends sent emotional videos filled with photos of me as a child, as a servant, as a construction volunteer, begging me to stay. My body collapsed under the pressure. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook uncontrollably. That was my first full anxiety attack. The fire had already started. I initially believed the announcement would happen immediately. Only later did I remember the 7-day appeal period that follows a dissociation. That delay didn't bring relief. It only extended the tension. I was already gone, but not yet publicly erased. I was suspended in limbo. What came next was pressure disguised as concern. Elders reached out, framing everything as emotional instability. "You're not well. This isn't you. You just need time." Then the real message arrived, carefully worded, but unmistakable. I was given 2 options. Either I maintained my letter of dissociation, or I submitted to a judicial committee, not to help me, but to give an answer to the congregation, to protect the neighborhood from confusion. I understood immediately what that meant. A committee would not be about truth. It would be about control. My words would be dissected, my motives questioned, my character reshaped, and the outcome would already be decided. I refused. I said clearly, "Consider the letter." That was the moment the bridge burned completely. The following Wednesday, my name was announced publicly. Lucas is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Just one sentence erased years of devotion. I later learned that a week earlier, a talk warning about apostasy had been given. I wasn't imagining patterns. I was being framed in advance. Overnight, I became dangerous. Not because I lied, not because I sinned, but because I left. That realization hurt more than I expected, because it confirmed something devastating. Belonging had always been conditional. The loss was not only organizational, it was painfully personal. I was engaged. I loved her deeply, and I believed we were building a future together, step by step. When I left the organization, I tried to talk. I tried to explain calmly, honestly, without attacking anyone. She did not return. She stayed. I don't hate her for that choice. I understand the pressure. I understand the fear. But the silence cut deeper than any argument ever could. Overnight, I went from being a respected elder to someone untouchable, an apostate, a danger, a name people avoided saying out loud. I kept asking myself what crime I had committed. Had I spoken against God? Had I denied Christ? Had I lied? The answer was always no. My crime was dissent. My crime was conscience. And the punishment was erasure. People who once trusted me with their lives crossed the street to avoid me. Friends who called me brother stopped acknowledging my existence. The social death was immediate and total. And yet, buried beneath the devastation, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Painful, frightening relief. The relief of no longer pretending. The relief of no longer performing. The relief of finally choosing myself, even while everything else collapsed around me. I began to understand how calculated the system truly is when it comes to exits. There is no humane way out. Either you disappear quietly, accepting invisibility and shame, or you are publicly labeled and erased. I had tried to leave with dignity, and dignity was not permitted. Control had to be restored. Fear had to be reinforced. My story had to be neutralized before it spread. I replayed conversations in my mind endlessly, searching for a version where this ended differently. But deep down, I knew the truth. There is no correct way to leave a high-control group. The system does not want closure. It wants obedience. Once obedience ends, empathy ends with it. I began to see my entire past through a new lens. The sacrifices, the swallowed doubts, the emotional contortions. They were not signs of strength or faith. They were signs of conditioning. I had confused endurance with virtue and silence with loyalty. Realizing that was devastating, but also clarifying. I was not losing real relationships. I was losing contracts. And contracts are not love. The grief was real and heavy, but so was the awakening. For the first time, I allowed myself to name what had happened to me without apologizing for it. In the days following the announcement, my body remained trapped in survival mode. Sleep came in fragments. My appetite vanished. My thoughts raced without mercy. I swung between panic and numbness, unable to settle into either. But slowly, something subtle began to change. Without meetings, without constant monitoring, without the pressure to perform spirituality, my nervous system started to breathe again. The world felt unfamiliar, almost unsafe, yet strangely lighter. I did small things that once felt forbidden. Ordinary things, human things. I went to a soccer match. I stood in the crowd without guilt. I posted a photo wearing a team jersey. Nothing dramatic happened. No punishment arrived. No lightning struck. That moment shattered a powerful illusion. I realized how deeply fear had been implanted in me, how control had lived inside my own thoughts long after the rules were gone. Freedom did not arrive as joy. It arrived as silence. And inside that silence, I began to hear my own voice again. That terrified me. I had spent my entire life being told what to think, what to feel, what to want. Hearing myself for the first time was overwhelming, but it was also the first step toward healing, even if healing still felt distant and fragile. I do not tell this story to be admired or praised. I tell it because silence protects systems, not people. I know there are others like me. Elders, ministerial servants, pioneers, people suffocating quietly, convinced that the problem is them. It isn't. The system is designed to keep you busy enough not to think, and fearful enough not to question. It rewards obedience and punishes honesty. Leaving costs everything you were promised. Staying costs who you actually are. That is the real equation. I lost status. I lost community. I lost the future I had carefully planned. But I regained something I did not even realize I had surrendered. Agency. My life is mine again. My thoughts are mine. My conscience belongs to me. That may sound small to someone outside, but to someone raised inside control, it is everything. I am still rebuilding. I am still grieving. I am still unlearning fear, but I am no longer living a lie. And that matters more than any title, privilege, or approval I ever held. The announcement was made. The relationship was lost. The community disappeared. I am standing in the aftermath, surrounded by emotional wreckage, but fully awake for the first time. What comes next is not easy. Reconstruction never is. There is grief without rituals, anger without permission, and loneliness that arrives without warning. But there is also truth. For the first time in my life, I am not rebuilding myself for approval. I am not measuring my worth by usefulness. I am not shrinking to fit a role. I am rebuilding for honesty, for integrity, for peace that does not depend on obedience. That shift changes everything. I no longer need to be exceptional to be loved. I no longer need to perform to exist. I can simply be human. And that, after a lifetime of control, feels radical. The collapse is complete. The exit is irreversible. And while the cost was immense, the alternative would have cost me my soul. This is where the old life ends, and where something painfully real uncertain, and finally free begins. After the rupture, silence became my new environment. There were no meetings to rush to, no messages demanding reports, no expectations to perform spirituality on command. At first, that silence felt dangerous. I had been conditioned to associate silence with spiritual failure. If nothing was scheduled, something must be wrong. If no one was watching, I must be drifting. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I felt restless, alert, as if I were forgetting an important obligation. I would wake up suddenly, convinced I had missed a meeting. I would check my phone instinctively, expecting a message of correction. None came, and that absence felt unsettling. For years, my identity had been externally regulated. Without that regulation, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I realized that I had never learned how to exist without permission. Even rest had always been justified as necessary for service. Now rest existed on its own, and that confused me. I wasn't immediately happy. Freedom didn't feel euphoric. It felt disorienting. But beneath the confusion, there was something else beginning to surface slowly. Curiosity. Not forbidden curiosity, not guilty curiosity, but simple human curiosity. What do I like? What do I believe? What do I feel when no one is grading me? Those questions frightened me, but they also marked the first step toward rebuilding a self that belonged to me. Guilt followed me everywhere during this phase. Not because I had done something wrong, but because guilt had been installed as a reflex. I felt guilty enjoying a free evening, guilty sleeping in, guilty watching things I had once been told were dangerous, guilty for not feeling guilty enough. That contradiction exhausted me. I began to understand how deeply indoctrination embeds itself into the nervous system. Even when beliefs collapse intellectually, emotional conditioning lingers. I caught myself mentally explaining my actions to imaginary elders, justifying my choices to people who were no longer present. That internalized surveillance was one of the hardest things to dismantle. I wasn't being watched anymore, but I was still policing myself. Slowly, I began naming it. This is not conscience. This is conditioning. That distinction mattered. True conscience invites reflection. Conditioning demands obedience. As I learned to separate the two, the guilt softened. Not disappeared, softened. I also began to grieve properly. Not just the people I lost, but the version of myself that never had a chance to exist. The young man who didn't choose freely. The adult who postponed life for a future that was always just out of reach. That grief was heavy, but honest. And honesty, I learned, is the foundation of real healing. Identity reconstruction was not linear. Some days I felt strong and clear. Other days I felt hollow, unsure, stripped of meaning. For years, meaning had been supplied to me fully packaged. I didn't have to ask why. I only had to comply. Now I had to build meaning from the inside out. That was terrifying. I began to notice how often I asked myself, is this allowed? Instead of, is this healthy? That single shift in questioning exposed how distorted my moral framework had been. I had been trained to obey rules, not to develop wisdom, so I started small. I listened to music without analyzing its lyrics for hidden danger. I read books without checking the author's background. I allowed myself to feel emotions without labeling them spiritual threats. Slowly, my emotional range expanded. Joy returned in fragments. Sadness came without shame. Anger surfaced, raw and overdue. I learned that anger is not evil. It is information. It points to violated boundaries. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge how much had been taken from me without my consent. That acknowledgement didn't turn me bitter. It turned me grounded. Identity, I realized, is not something you receive. It's something you reclaim, piece by piece, after it has been suppressed for too long. Faith was the most complicated territory to navigate. For a long time, faith and organization had been inseparable in my mind. To question one felt like betraying the other. After leaving, I oscillated between fear and rejection. Some days I wanted nothing to do with anything spiritual. Other days I felt a quiet longing for transcendence, for meaning beyond material survival. I began to understand that my problem was never God. It was mediation, authority, control. I explored spirituality cautiously, without urgency. I listened to sermons from different traditions. I read perspectives I had once been warned against, and instead of fear, I felt resonance, not certainty resonance. I realized that genuine faith does not coerce, it invites. It does not demand uniformity. It allows doubt. It welcomes questions. That realization was both comforting and destabilizing. I had been told that truth is narrow, rigid, exclusive. But what I encountered was something broader, quieter, less theatrical. I didn't rush to redefine my beliefs. I gave myself permission not to know. That alone felt radical. For the first time, my spirituality was not monitored, measured, or reported. It was private, personal, evolving. And that made it feel real in a way it never had before. Relationships outside the organization were another learning curve. I realized how underdeveloped my social world had been. Most of my relationships had existed within a closed ecosystem, governed by shared rules and constant reinforcement. Outside that system, interactions were freer, but also less scripted. People didn't expect me to perform righteousness. They didn't ask about my spiritual routine. They asked about me. That felt strange at first. I had to learn how to be present without a role, how to listen without correcting, how to connect without evaluating. I also had to confront loneliness honestly. Leaving cost me an entire social network overnight. That kind of loss leaves a vacuum. Some days the silence felt peaceful. Other days it felt unbearable. But I resisted the temptation to fill it immediately. I didn't want replacement belonging. I wanted authentic connection. Slowly, new relationships formed, not based on agreement, but on respect. Not conditional on belief, but grounded in shared humanity. I learned that disagreement doesn't equal danger. That difference doesn't require distance. That was liberating. It also highlighted how restricted my previous world had been. Love outside control feels quieter, less dramatic, but far more stable. It doesn't threaten abandonment as punishment. It doesn't need fear to survive. And once you experience that, it's impossible to unsee how transactional your former relationships truly were. I also began reevaluating success. For years, success had meant visibility, privileges, and approval from authority. Outside the system, none of that mattered. My career, my education, my personal growth suddenly belonged to me. I revisited old regrets with a gentler lens. I had lost opportunities, yes. But I had also survived an environment designed to consume people. That mattered. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I produced for others. I started measuring it by my well-being. Was I sleeping? Was I calm? Was I present? Those became valid metrics. I allowed myself to dream without filtering those dreams through organizational expectations. I imagined a future not defined by service quotas or reputational risk. That freedom felt expansive and frightening. Responsibility returned to me fully. There was no script to follow. No promised paradise to justify sacrifice. Just life, here and now. And strangely, that made life more precious, not less. I began to understand that postponing life for an imagined future is one of the most effective forms of control. Reclaiming the present became an act of resistance, and for the first time, resistance felt aligned with integrity, not rebellion. Residual fear did not vanish overnight. Certain phrases, tones, and expressions still triggered anxiety. I noticed how deeply language had been used as a control mechanism. Words like danger, association, and apostate still carried emotional weight. I worked actively to dismantle that conditioning. I reminded myself that words only have power when we accept their framing. I reframed my story repeatedly. I was not weak. I was not deceived. I was not immoral. I was someone who chose conscience over compliance. That reframing mattered. Healing required narrative correction. I also confronted the fear of judgment. For years, I had lived under constant evaluation. Now I practice living without explanation, not defending my choices, not justifying my life. That was uncomfortable at first, but deeply empowering. I learned that privacy is not secrecy. It is autonomy. I didn't owe my story to anyone. I shared it intentionally, not compulsively. That distinction restored agency. Over time, fear loosened its grip. Not because it disappeared, but because it was no longer in charge. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward without letting fear dictate your values. Looking back, I can see how systematically my autonomy had been dismantled over time. Not through force, but through gradual normalization. Each small compromise made the next easier. Each surrendered boundary felt justified at the time. Understanding that helped me forgive myself. I stopped blaming my past self for not leaving sooner. He didn't lack intelligence or strength. He lacked information and safety. Leaving earlier would have cost too much psychologically. I left when I could survive it. That compassion toward myself was essential. Shame dissolves when met with understanding. I also began to contextualize my anger. Anger is not bitterness when it is grounded in truth. It becomes fuel for boundaries. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted to live in alignment. And alignment, I learned, requires continuous adjustment. Healing is not about becoming who you were before. It's about becoming someone new, informed by experience but not defined by trauma. I allowed myself to imagine a future where my past didn't control my reactions. That future felt possible, even if distant. Possibility itself became a source of hope. I now understand that leaving did not make me lose my life. It gave it back to me. The grief remains, but it no longer defines me. I am learning how to hold complexity without collapsing into certainty. I am learning that not knowing is not a failure. It is a human condition. I don't need absolute answers to live meaningfully. I need honesty, compassion, and presence. Those are things no organization can monopolize. I still encounter moments of sadness when I think about the people I lost. That pain is real, but it no longer tempts me to return to something that harmed me. I have learned that belonging should never require self-erasure. Love should not depend on silence. Faith should not demand fear. These realizations didn't come cheaply. They were purchased with loss. But they are mine, and I protect them carefully. My life now moves at a human pace. Not rushed by urgency, not frozen by dread, just lived. That simplicity feels revolutionary after years of pressure. I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I know who I am becoming, and that knowledge is enough for now. I am standing in a life that is imperfect and honest, instead of polished and controlled. I no longer measure my worth by obedience or sacrifice. I measure it by authenticity, by peace, by the ability to say no without fear. Leaving did not solve all my problems. It gave me the freedom to face them without lies. And that is a profound difference. I don't claim certainty. I don't claim superiority. I claim responsibility for my own life. That responsibility once terrified me. Now it grounds me. I am still healing. I am still learning. But I am free to do so at my own pace. This is not an ending. It is a continuation. A life reclaimed from fear and lived in truth. And for the first time, that feels enough. As I reached the far edge of this journey, I finally understood that my story was never just about leaving a religion. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own life. For years, my narrative had been written for me, edited by authority, approved by committees, and distributed through expectations I never chose. Leaving forced me to confront the terrifying responsibility of writing my own meaning. That responsibility once felt like abandonment. Now, it feels like dignity. I began to see my past not as wasted years, but as context. Painful context, yes, but context that sharpened my awareness and clarified my values. I stopped asking whether my decisions would be approved and started asking whether they were honest. That shift reoriented everything. I learned that truth does not need consensus to exist. It only needs courage to be lived. I also learned that losing certainty does not mean losing direction. It means choosing direction consciously. The fear that once controlled me now serves as information, not instruction. I listen to it, but I no longer obey it blindly. That distinction has changed how I move through the world. I am no longer running toward approval or away from punishment. I am walking toward coherence. And coherence, I discovered, is the quiet foundation of a life that can finally breathe without permission. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself in my story, I want you to know something clearly. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are not failing spiritually. High control systems thrive by convincing good people that exhaustion is holiness and silence is loyalty. If you feel tired, confused, or empty while doing everything right, that is not proof of personal failure. It is a signal worth honoring. I spent years believing that discomfort meant I needed more discipline. In reality, it meant I needed honesty. Your conscience is not your enemy. It is not rebellious. It is not dangerous. It is protective. It exists to preserve your integrity, not to sabotage your faith. If your inner voice has been whispering questions you are afraid to ask out loud, listen carefully. Questions are not corruption. They are cognition. And cognition is what makes us human. You do not owe your life to an institution that cannot love you without conditions. Love that disappears when obedience ends was never love. It was leverage. Walking away from leverage is not betrayal. It is self-respect. And self-respect is not incompatible with goodness. It is often the beginning of it. There is a myth that leaving means falling into chaos, immorality, or emptiness. That myth exists because fear is an effective fence. My reality has been different. Life outside control is not perfect, but it is honest. I still struggle. I still grieve. I still question. But my struggles are mine. They are not framed as spiritual defects or moral failures. They are part of being human. I have learned that morality does not collapse without supervision. In fact, it often becomes clearer. When you are no longer acting to avoid punishment, your values become visible. Compassion becomes a choice, not a command. Integrity becomes internal, not performative. I am kinder now, not because I am required to be, but because I want to be. That distinction matters. I also learned that community built on fear cannot survive honesty, but community built on respect can survive difference. My circle is smaller now, but it is real. There are no hidden ledgers, no reports, no ranking, just people meeting each other as they are. That simplicity once felt threatening. Now it feels sacred. I no longer need a promised future to justify my present suffering. This life, as it is, deserves care. And I am finally free to give it that care without apology. I want to speak directly to those who are still inside and watching from a distance, afraid of what listening might mean. I understand you. I was you. I know the cost of curiosity. I know the fear of losing everything you know in exchange for uncertainty. I am not here to pull you out. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am here to tell you that you are allowed to think. You are allowed to feel. You are allowed to notice when something hurts. You are allowed to prioritize your mental health without spiritualizing your pain. If you choose to stay, let it be because you truly want to, not because you are afraid to leave. If you choose to leave, let it be because you value truth more than comfort. Either way, the choice should be yours. Autonomy is not dangerous. Suppressing it is. No loving God would require you to abandon your conscience to prove loyalty. No healthy community would demand silence as the price of belonging. If your faith requires you to disappear, it is not faith. It is control. And control does not deserve your soul. Whatever you decide, know that your worth is not determined by your compliance. You are valuable because you exist, not because you perform. I also want to acknowledge the complexity of grief that follows leaving. Grief is not linear. Some days you feel strong. Other days a memory hits without warning and knocks the air out of your lungs. That does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means you cared deeply. Losing an entire worldview is not small. Losing people you loved is not small. Allow yourself to mourn without turning that mourning into regret. Grief does not mean you want to go back. It means you lost something that mattered. Both truths can coexist. I learned to stop arguing with my sadness. I let it exist without letting it decide for me. Over time, grief softened. It made room for new experiences, new laughter, new meaning. I learned that healing is not forgetting. It is remembering without being controlled by the memory. That took patience. And patience was something I had never practiced before. Everything inside the system is urgent. Everything demands immediacy. Healing outside it moves slowly. That slowness is not weakness, it is restoration. Give yourself time, you are not late. You are right on time for your own life. One of the most profound shifts I experienced was learning how to trust myself. For years, self-trust had been portrayed as arrogance. Independent thought was framed as danger. Obedience was presented as safety. Leaving forced me to reverse that equation. I began practicing small acts of self-trust, making decisions without seeking permission, changing my mind without guilt, saying no without explanation. Each act felt risky at first, but each one strengthened something inside me that had been dormant for years. I realized that intuition is not rebellion, it is accumulated wisdom. When you silence it long enough, it grows faint, but it does not disappear, it waits. Trusting myself did not make me reckless, it made me responsible. Responsibility without coercion is a different experience altogether. I am accountable to my values now, not to rules enforced through fear. That accountability feels heavier at times, but it is also cleaner. There is no one to blame, no system to hide behind, just choices and consequences. That honesty is grounding. I no longer outsource my conscience, I carry it. And carrying it has made me more present, more deliberate, and more alive than I ever was when I was being directed. As this story reaches its end, I want to be clear about one thing. I am not telling you what to think about Jehovah's Witnesses or any religion. I am telling you what happened to me. This is my experience, my perspective, my truth. Others may have different stories. That does not invalidate mine. Control thrives by demanding a single narrative. Healing begins when multiple truths are allowed to exist side by side. I am not here to replace one authority with another. I am here to remove authority from places it does not belong. Your life belongs to you. Your mind belongs to you. Your conscience belongs to you. Any belief system that requires you to surrender those things should be questioned carefully. I no longer need to convince anyone of anything. I no longer need validation for my journey. Sharing this is not an act of defiance. It is an act of integration. I am integrating my past, not erasing it. I am acknowledging what was real without allowing it to define what comes next. That balance took time. It took pain, but it brought peace. And peace, I learned, is not found in certainty. It is found in alignment. If there is one message I want to leave you with, it is this. You do not need to destroy your life to reclaim it. You only need to stop living a life that is destroying you. That distinction matters. Leaving does not mean burning everything down. It means refusing to continue in environments that require your silence to function. Courage does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a quiet decision made in private. Sometimes it looks like rest. Sometimes it looks like saying, "This hurts, and I will not ignore it anymore." I did not become fearless. I became honest. And honesty changed the trajectory of my life. I do not know exactly where this path leads, but I trust myself enough now to walk it without guarantees. That trust is something no organization ever gave me. I built it myself, slowly, imperfectly, and with great effort, and because I built it, it cannot be taken away. Whatever you decide to do with your own life, remember this. You are allowed to choose health over approval, truth over comfort, integrity over belonging. Those choices are not sins, they are survival. I carry my past with me, but it no longer carries me. I have learned how to hold complexity without collapsing into extremes. I no longer need to label people as good or bad, saved or lost. Life is more nuanced than that. I have found meaning in small things, ordinary moments, conversations without agendas, days without evaluation. Those moments once seemed insignificant. Now they feel rich. I also accept that healing is ongoing. There is no finish line, no final approval, just continued attention to what feels honest and life-giving. I am still learning. I am still unlearning. But I am doing so freely. That freedom does not erase pain. It contextualizes it. Pain becomes part of growth, not evidence of failure. And growth no longer requires permission. That realization alone would have been worth everything I lost. I am not special for leaving. I am simply human for choosing to live with integrity. And integrity, I have discovered, is quieter than performance but far more durable. It does not need applause. It does not need reinforcement. It sustains itself through consistency. That is the life I am building now, one grounded in truth, humility, and compassion. For myself and for others. This is where the story ends, and where my life continues. Not as an example, not as a warning, just as a person who chose to stop betraying himself. I once believed that obedience was the highest form of virtue. Now I know that honesty is. I once believed that safety came from conformity. Now I know it comes from self-trust. I once believed that leaving meant losing everything. Now I understand that staying would have cost me more. The fear that once ruled me no longer decides my future. I decide it, slowly, thoughtfully, imperfectly. And that is enough. If my story helps even one person feel less alone, then sharing it was worth it. If it gives someone language for what they are feeling, then it has done its work. You are not crazy for questioning. You are not broken for leaving. You are not evil for choosing yourself. You are human, and being human was never the problem. The problem was being told that it was. This chapter closes here. Not with certainty, not with final answers, but with something better. Freedom, earned at great cost, and finally claimed.
This channel exists because stories like this are often silenced. Here, we give voice to people who lived inside controlling religions and carried emotions they were never allowed to express. If this story resonated with you, know that you're not alone, and this space is for you. I also wrote an ebook for those who are questioning, healing, or trying to understand what they lived. The link will be in the first pinned comment. Thank you for being here, for listening with respect, and for helping these stories be heard.